Raspberry Pi has removed the default Pi username. This has been added as a new security feature, but it also has the risk of breaking numerous programs and tutorials. Is it worth the change? Before I explain the pros and cons, I'll just say that I've had a Raspberry Pi which is configured as a server and is directly connected to the internet. On that computer I already changed the username, and that was several years ago. In that case, the existing Pi username is still there, but it's been disabled. Whilst security was a consideration, it was really more about consistency, and I've implemented other steps to secure the server beyond the normal username-password combination. A bit of a background. The default username for the Raspberry Pi has always been Pi. Not only that, but the default password is Raspberry. In the past, that meant if you had your Raspberry Pi connected to the internet during setup, you could end up in a position where someone could log in remotely to the computer using the default credentials. There was not much incentive to change your password, and that was a very big risk. Fortunately, that was fixed some time ago by having it prompt to change the password during first run. That was a big change and a significant improvement in security. The change this time is not as significant in terms of the additional security it provides, but it will have a significant change to how some programs work and some tutorials. So how big a risk is having a default username? Is the password secure enough? As with many things in security, it depends. It depends how exposed your Raspberry Pi is. It depends what kind of attack is likely to happen, and it depends how good your password is. This is going to get a bit technical now. If you just want to get to the implications for software or want to see how to configure a new username during install, then you can skip this chapter and move to the practical applications. Still here? We can now look at some of the risks of the password-based authentication. I'm going to consider a few examples, and for this I'm going to assume that network login attempts across an untrusted network, like the internet. Let's assume you have a Raspberry Pi connected to the internet, which allows SSH logins from the internet. I'm assuming a script-based attack by a user that doesn't know much about the computer or the user they're targeting. So we'll take to the first risk, which is the worst case scenario. You have a username of Pi and you've left your password as Raspberry. This is clearly just asking for trouble. It is trivial for an attacker to take a list of well-known username and passwords and just try them against a machine. If someone knows it's a Raspberry Pi they are attacking and you have network services open that allow logins, then it's likely their first guess and they can immediately get on your machine. We're going to take the next step, what I call a stupid password. So we're no longer using the default password, but it's a well-known password. Again, this is going to be quite easy, and this is why I've called it stupid passwords. So here's one of the common passwords, 123456. And as we just go through some of the more common ones, things like QWERTY is a combination of the keyboard, password, more number-based ones, things like password 123, QWERTY 123. For instance, all these, if you're using one of these passwords, then these are easy to guess. And if it's on this list, then it's not really that much better than using the default password. Assuming you know the username, then it would be trivial to make 20 or so login attempts. Using one of these passwords is very insecure. The next consideration is if the system has a password that is not on the popular password list, but it's based on something that could be guessed by a computer. By this I mean simple words that are susceptible to a dictionary attack. It's easy enough to get a copy of a dictionary of words, and this is one of the reasons that the security policies often insist on including numbers or sometimes special characters. This is partly due to the number of additional permutations required for a brute force attack, which I'll cover next, but it can make the password less susceptible for dictionary attacks. I only say can because it really depends upon the user. If all they do is just add a 1 to the end of a word, that does not really add much extra protection. And dictionaries also include words where substitutions are made within the password, such as swapping an I for a 1 or an E with 3. You can see this in this snapshot from a dictionary called RockU. This dictionary has around 14 million words. It's not something you're likely to get through by manually trying passwords, but with some level of automation, there's a chance that somebody can get into your system. With enough resources, the risk of someone being able to get into the computer is feasible. So the next level of security, and this is what we should really all be doing, is to use a proper complex password. In an ideal world, this would be a completely random combination of lowercase letters, capital letters, digits and special characters. Although in reality, our human brains would find that hard to remember, resulting in the password being written down, which is another risk. So it may be better to combine multiple unrelated words with occasional digits and perhaps special characters. In this case, an attacker would perhaps have to look at using a brute force attack. And this is where an attacker tries every possible permutation of characters to guess the password. It doesn't completely prevent a lucky guess, but the number of possibilities increases exponentially based on the number of characters in the password. I'm going to simplify the conditions here and the calculations, but these give you an idea of whether it's worth the effort of a hacker even trying this. Let's start by looking at a fairly basic password, which is exactly 6 characters long using only letters. 26 letters in the English alphabet with 6 independent characters, and that gives around 300 million combinations. If you add in some capital letters and digits, that gives 62 possible characters, which puts us into the billions of possible combinations. You could add some special characters and increase that slightly, but really the thing to do to make a password more secure is to add more characters. If you set the minimum characters to 7 using letters and digits, then the number of permutations is now in the trillions. And for 8 characters, that is around 218 trillion possible combinations. This assumes the password's exactly 8 characters long. The numbers of possibilities would increase even further if that's just the minimum number of characters. When we're looking at attacks against a complex password, we're looking at how many attempts can be done and in what period of time. And there's a number of factors on here, but bear in mind this is a network connection we're looking at, and so there's a number of simultaneous login attempts that can be made. This can be determined by the SSH settings, the processor speed of the Raspberry Pi, the bandwidth, and any additional security features that may have been added. But in case of a really complicated password, it might take years to be able to have enough guesses to have a reasonable chance of guessing that password, perhaps even 1,000 years, or as you add more characters it could be much longer. So as I say, this is only specifically about network attacks, and there's always the possibility of a lucky guess, but the probability of that is so low. So essentially complex passwords are very difficult to break using brute force. Now we'll move on to changing the username and have a look at how this is going to affect these different passwords. First, we're going to skip the default username and password. If you change the username, then I certainly hope you're going to change the password from the default as well, so that's not really that relevant. Let's look at the well-known passwords, the common password attack. So if you take the first 20 possible passwords, take the top 20 most common usernames, that gives you a combination of around 400 possible combinations. That's certainly slightly better than the 20, but with some simple scripts, you can potentially crack that within a few hours. So changing the username to a common username with your common password is not really going to add much additional security. The one where it perhaps adds more security is against the dictionary attacks. We assume that you want to avoid the top 20, but usernames do tend to follow a more simpler pattern than passwords. So we're not going to be looking at the same number of different usernames as number of passwords. So if we consider a fairly common username, perhaps something with the top 100, and that word can be found in a cracker dictionary, there may be over 1 billion possible combinations. And whilst this may take a while, it's feasible that that particular username and combination and password combination may be guessed. Or if you add some digits and special characters in the password or a more unique username, there's a good chance that this could take what otherwise may be a fairly poor password and make it much more secure. And then finally, looking at the brute force, I've already said a brute force attack is unlikely to be successful. It's just not worth putting the resources in to try and do a brute force attack over the network. But adding a different username makes this even less likely to succeed because of the number of possible combinations. So it potentially removes that risk of somebody by luck getting an early brute force attack, a lucky guess. From a security perspective, I'd argue that using a good password is more important than whether it's a default username or not. However, changing the default username does add an additional element of security, and that's always a good thing. The thing about security, it's not something you just switch on and off. It's about taking different measures just to make it harder for people to break in. And every one of those that you add is a good thing. This is purely looking at a default system. There are other ways that you could add security. I plan to come to some of those in a future video. For instance, I'm going to look at ways of securing the login using key-based authentication and multi-factor authentication. So please consider subscribing if you're interested in those, but for this video I'm just concentrating on the passwords. The fact that changing the username does add an additional security step is a good thing, but it does have a downside, which I'm going to look at next. And the downside is that software and tutorials have been written with the expectation that there will be a user called Pi, and that's where potentially the software is going to be installed. The Raspberry Pi is over 10 years old, and during that time it has always had that Pi username, so it has been a valid assumption to this point, and as a result lots of documentation, tutorials and software just hard codes the username or the path /home/pi into them. And that includes some of my own guides and the software I've written. And there's a good reason for doing this. It's because the Raspberry Pi is intended for education, including for use by school children or for use by people that are new to Linux, perhaps makers, and this is their first involvement in Linux. And therefore, as a result, try to make the tutorials or the software as easy to use as possible. Going forward, it's not actually that difficult to remove these dependencies. It's certainly possible to update tutorials, which can work regardless of the user IDs. Some software may be a little harder. For instance, if your program is being run as a local user, you can just use the tilde character or $home to refer to the home directory. But for applications that are designed to run as root or being started up automatically as a daemon, they don't necessarily have access to those variables, and it may be better to install into a different directory, perhaps the /opt directory, or within the normal Linux application folders such as USR and etc. You could even create a symbolic link of /home/pi to the real user's directory, or still use the pi username if you really wanted to. I suggest that would be only a temporary measure. Really should look at ways of integrating the program a bit better. It may be that you're confident enough about your password, or you have other security measures in place, so using the pi username is perfectly valid in those. So I've already made some changes to one of my projects, and this is the Pixel server program, which provides a web interface to allow you to control NeoPixels or RGB LEDs. Originally, this assumed it was installed in the Pi home directory, but I've now updated the instructions and some of the scripts so that it can now be installed in the /opt directory instead. As much as I've said this will only have a small improvement to the overall system security, it doesn't have to have much impact on the end users. In this example, it really didn't take much of an update, and the end users, as long as they follow the updated instructions, it'll still work fine. So overall, as this improves the security of the system, I actually see this as being quite a positive change for the Raspberry Pi. I'm now going to show a walkthrough showing how you can install Raspberry Pi OS and configure it with an alternative username. This is the Raspberry Pi Imager, which is the easiest way to install an image, and this has been updated with the new changes. Run this on your local PC and it will download the latest version of the operating system and install it onto the SD card. In this case I'm using the Raspberry Pi 64-bit version, but you can use the 32-bit version as well, particularly if you have an older model of the Raspberry Pi. Choose your SD card and click write, and it will take a while now to download the image over the internet and then install it onto your SD card. After installing to your SD card, you can boot that in the Raspberry Pi and you'll see this first run wizard start up. You first set your country, and that's important for the wireless install as well as setting your time zone. You'll then be prompted to create a user, and in this case I'm creating a user called Pixel Server, and of course giving it a secure password. You can then connect to your wireless network, install the updates, and you'll need to reboot, and it's as simple as that. That's the Raspberry Pi setup with a non-default username. If you want to run your Raspberry Pi in headless mode, that's without a screen or keyboard attached, then you can configure the new username using the Imager software. Before starting the write, click on the settings icon, and that will allow you to set that before you install to the SD card. And there's some other new features in there, so you can set your Raspberry Pi up straight away, ready for headless mode. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this useful. If so, please give it a like. I plan to create more videos on cybersecurity, guides for both computer users and those interested in understanding what hackers and crackers do, so that you can understand how to make your own systems more secure. Please click on subscribe and the notification icon to get notified when I create more videos in the future. I look forward to seeing you on a future video.